But we've got a great speaker tonight. I want to introduce Scott Carlson with Schnieder Tree Care. You know, I've known Scott for a long time, and we've been partners in crime for conservation in the Upstate, education in the Upstate, advocating for the right things. And every event from, the Turkey Day race and, Trees Upstate has to any other event you see out there, these public events, you'll see Scott there advocating, educating constantly for the value of trees. Sometimes we overlook the value of trees, and really scientifically how they form the basis of our ecosystem. They're the cornerstone of the climatic change on this planet. And we have to appreciate trees for what they do for us and the ecosystem services that they do for us. And so you think about this term ecosystem services. That's what Scott is going to bring to the table tonight, what trees do for us. And then with Helene that hit us back in September, we're all still kind of recovering from that. And so Scott's going to help us now to understand what that means and what that looks like for us. And so Scott, come on up and give us a good talk.
Thank you, Rick. It's so good to be here amongst plant people. I just did an Arbor Day celebration down at the Kilgore Lewis house this afternoon. People were talking about the hotel and all sorts of different things. So I'm so proud to be here. It's been a while since I've been to a native plant thing, and just to have the conversations, because this is where a lot of it comes from. And it's neat to know everything that y'all are involved in and what you're doing, and all the other organizations that are doing, similar things. I just put up here, I've been involved with Trees Upstate for a long time, and you see 3 similar words: plant, promote, protect. I think y'all add education to that. Obviously, we're educating in part of that, but I'm one of the founding board members of Trees Upstate, and really enjoy the mission and that organization. And we're giving away trees and getting the word out there about trees. And really, and back to what Rick opened up with, and I mean, I feel like a lot of the issues that we're dealing with related to climate and air and temperatures and things like that, trees can solve almost all of those. I remember reading an article, they're talking about down in Charleston about, flooding issues down there. And they came to the realization, one of the things is to plant more trees, because the amount of water that a mature tree can suck out of the soil is incredible. So as plant folks and tree folks, y'all know a lot of this, but we're going to get into this a little bit. I want to get into, first of all, I like to just talk a bit about, just kind of trees, because trees are a forest plant. And what does that mean? What does that look like? What's going on there? And then we'll kind of talk about urban, what an urban tree has to deal with. And then we'll get into some tree biology. So it's good to kind of understand all this. So education is a big part of this. And then we will dive into, okay, what was Helene like? And what are storms like? And what do we do in those situations? And what are we doing now? There's a lot of reaction to that, and how we're kind of responding as folks that are now, we don't live in Florida. We don't deal with hurricanes like that as often as our southern neighbors or our coastal neighbors. So I don't know if any of y'all ever read any of the books, Finding the Mother Tree or The Hidden Life of Trees, but as you get into, and Rick and I were discussing before this, how things are so interconnected. So a lot of people, I will show this picture of a forest and say, hey, what do you think? And they're like, it looks crowded, it looks congested, it looks, like there's competition going on there. And that isn't the case. That trees are a community plant. And that if you want to know more about that, either one of these books, Hidden Life of Trees is the one I've read. I know that Finding the Mother Tree, but it talks about the interconnectedness of trees to each other, and how that happens in the soil with microbes and all sorts of cool stuff. That's a whole nother talk. But that when you have trees in a forest environment, the temperature is cooler. So if you're a tree and you're interested in, cooler temperatures and moisture and so forth, it's going to be beneficial to have a shaded environment. So for a tree, when a tree falls down in a forest, more sunlight hits that forest floor and more water evaporates. So trees benefit from each other. And so that's important to know, because a lot of our urban trees, don't have that anymore. They're not as connected as they would be in a forest environment. Trees can share resources. There's water conservation going on here. A lot of organic material acts like a sponge. They shelter each other. You know, if we have wind, that's going to, and I know a lot of us, when we had the storm, you know, the hurricane, that was a very unique event. So let me start with that, because even I live on a few acres, and I had trees blown over. It's like, well, I thought trees protect each other. Well, there's unique events, and we'll get into what that looks like. But generally speaking, you know, a group of trees is going to stand better together than a tree by itself. And when a tree or two falls, now air can get down into that pocket and get down into the lower canopy and actually cause more damage. So let's just talk about urban trees in general, because Greenville, I grew up here. I'm pretty much born and raised. I've lived here since I was 2. We're all seeing Greenville grow. And we know we have towns to the north and south of us. You know, we got Charlotte and Atlanta and all those sorts of things. But the reality is the average lifespan of an urban tree is about 19 to 28 years. And there's a lot of reasons for that. A lot of it has to do with that trees aren't getting in this type of environment what they normally would get out in nature. You don't have that recycled organic material. Trees actually do a pretty good job of taking care of themselves. Leaves fall, they decompose, they go back into the soil. But that isn't the case when we're cleaning up the leaves and taking care of a lawn and that sort of thing. And not that that's a bad thing, but there are some elements that are missing that are key to understand. So a lot of our trees really only make it to like their adolescent years. They really never live to kind of a mature age. When we're talking about an urban environment. And a lot of that has to do with where we try and plant trees. We have the trees on Main Street in downtown Greenville. We love those trees. We've been part of taking care of those for a period of time. We put them in golf courses and lawns. And we plant these trees and we go, oh, they'll just thrive. And we expect them not to just live, but thrive in these environments. And it's tough. I thought I heard a question. I have a question. Okay. So anyway, so these are some of the things that urban trees kind of deal with and why they tend to be kind of shorter lived. So in urban settings, you're dealing with soil compaction. So root growth isn't as vigorous as it normally would be. Root damage. So we saw trees that fell over that maybe years ago, a water line, a sewer line, something had been put in next to the tree. So the tree had, prior root damage that the tree may never have died from, but it never regrew those structural roots like it had early on. So root damage, we were just talking about, I think we were talking about internet and underground utilities, a lot of fiber and things like that are going into the ground. And a lot of that is around tree roots. And a lot of times people don't think about that. Or people say, well, they didn't cut any of the big roots. Well, it's all these small little hair-like roots near the surface that are actually what are key in feeding the trees. And then of course, as we, mow our own lawns, you're even just walking around on the ground can compact the soil. So, again, things that trees deal with in an urban environment that they don't necessarily deal with out in nature. So let me dump into, so let's get into a little bit of tree biology, because I think that's important to understand, because I get people that go, well, that tree's shallow rooted, oftentimes when we talk about pine trees, oh, they're not good, they're shallow rooted. So let's talk about where these roots grow and how deep they get. A lot of people think trees will have a tap root. Now, I'm assuming all of y'all saw Hurricane Helene and most of the trees came out of the ground. What did those root systems look like? They're flat, right? So they look kind of like this picture here with the fallen pine tree. Not very deep. And people go, well, that tree just doesn't have deep roots. Well, roots need 3 things: water, nutrients, and oxygen. You get into our clay soils, oxygen gets pretty low. Now, if you get towards the coast, sandier soils, you probably get roots that grow deeper, but the soils probably aren't quite as stable as, our clay is pretty stout stuff, but it's hard for roots to get down in there. But even then, like in our soils, in the upper 3 feet, maybe 4 feet is about as deep as they go for just about any tree. So did anybody see a tree that uprooted and you saw like a big, I'll call it a taproot that snapped off? No. So I remember a speaker I listened to one time, he was talking about tap roots. He's like, what do, I think he said like Superman, the Easter Bunny, and whatever all have in common? It's that a tree, it's that a taproot doesn't necessarily exist. And that, you know, when you first plant a tree, it will send down a small root, but very quickly it turns to the side and grows outward. So there is no real tap root when we're talking about trees. Now, some trees have a more aggressive root system than others. A lot of maples, good, bad, or otherwise, not many sweet gums fell over. They have a pretty tenacious root system. But everything grows outward, not downward. In the majority, in species, particularly in our area. So here's a question. So I'd like to make this a little more interactive. I know we have folks online here, but and so if you answer, we'll I'll kind of share it through the microphone. But how far on a tree made like this, how far do the roots extend, would you say? No wrong answers, by the way. Well, no wrong guesses. Okay, as far as the drip line, that's one. Okay. Further than that, okay. You want to expound on that or just further than that? I'm good with that answer. Because you've been out there digging in your yard. Okay, gotcha.
The infamous varies from place to place.
Okay, yep. Gotcha. So generally speaking, the root system can extend 2 to 3 times the distance of the drip line. And the challenge with a drip line, if you have a 20-inch oak tree growing out in the middle of a field, and you have a 20-inch oak tree growing in a forest, and, you know, of course, the canopy's tighter because of the competition around it above ground. Does that mean the roots didn't extend out as far? No, not necessarily. You know, a tree out in a field will extend much further, but that root system is still going out in all directions for both species of the same size. So in this situation, I would say the area, well, let's use this. Let's pretend this is a 12-inch diameter tree. So generally speaking, that no violation zone, or what we call the critical root zone, extends about 1.5 feet for every inch of trunk diameter. So for those of you good at math, I think that's about 18 feet. So on a 12-inch tree, this is about 18 feet. That's about as far as the branches extend. Oftentimes, if a tree is allowed to extend in all directions based on sunlight and trees around it, but the entirety of that root system extends well beyond that, which to me is just incredible. So the mass that's underground is something else. Now, I added this, the word root plate, because a lot of what we saw come out of the ground was within 6 to 8 feet of the trunk that came out of the ground. And that's where the structural buttress roots really are at the base of the tree. And that's what broke loose. So within that critical root zone, which, you know, if the tree lost some of these roots out beyond the no violation zone, it would probably be fine. I mean, yes, it would cause some damage to the tree, but it could probably live without those. When we deal with trees in construction, we're really trying to protect that critical root zone that is oftentimes found right underneath the canopy of the tree, or that 1 foot or 1.5 feet for every inch of trunk diameter. We try to protect that going away from the trunk of the tree. Is anybody surprised by that? Okay, yeah. Well, all y'all work in the ground. So yeah, if you've ever been digging in the ground going, where are the roots here? There isn't even a tree nearby. You know what that's like. Yes. Uh-huh. Mm-hmm. Yep. So we're talking about maple trees and mulch and girdling roots. Can I come back to you on that one? I took some of those slides out, but I still have one that pertains to that. But that's a good thing to talk about, because that also, that's a health issue, but that also can be a structural issue when we get into that. So, and maple roots will go, I mean, if this were a maple tree, no joke, this is how far those roots are going. I mean, you've seen them across the ground if you have a yard and hit the roots with your lawnmower. Yes.
I've got a garden house with forest around it.
Mm-hmm.
And I keep on getting amazed. I'm chilling up, I hit a root. I start digging, sweet gum root. Oh, that sweet gum's 30 feet away.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's when I'm starting to realize these roots, not just little itty bitty roots, but
Mhm.
an inch or two in diameter, making their way into my garden.
Yep. So you're that distance and you still have roots that size.
Yeah.
Yeah. And sweet gums, there are trees that have a more tenacious root system. You think of maple, sweet gum, a lot of your bottomland species that grow near water. You think of willows, river birch, those type of species tend to have a more aggressive root system because they have more demand for water and so forth. So one more thing when we kind of talk about urban trees, and I like to show this. So, again, roots are looking for water, nutrients, and oxygen. And a lot of those are living in that organic material, that leaf litter in a forest environment. Then we put in a lawn around trees, and that root mat now has competition called grass, lawn. And people love their grass. I get it. But it is tougher for trees to for feeder roots to compete in that environment. So this is a picture that's taken on the right of grass versus mulch, where they had a row of trees and they were mulched on one side and grass on the other, and they took a core sample and took a look at the volume of feeder root activity that was in those areas. And this shows the competition of grass versus in a mulch environment. So one of the things I say, as one of the best things you can do for your trees is to add mulch or extend mulch beds as you can. I get some people that go, well, if I mulched like that critical root zone of the tree, I wouldn't have a yard. So I understand that, but adding mulch holds moisture, regulates soil temperature, and provides a home for these feeder roots, which becomes very important for these trees that we want to keep in our yards. Hopefully that's the case. And we'll talk about that more as we kind of get into it. So let's dive in to Hurricane Helene. Because I think the topic I was asked to talk on, which I have not done so I found this very interesting. It's like, what is our relationship now with trees since Hurricane Helene? So this was a giant scientific experiment for us. I mean, I've been doing tree work in the Upstate for the last 20 some odd years, and we pruned trees, treated trees, like what made it, what didn't, what species, all sorts of things in this really unique event. So let's talk about what Helene was. Strong Category 4 storm that came ashore and really came into this area very powerfully. We had some rain beforehand, but Helene brought in 11.5 inches to Greenville. And these are different areas. Table Rock had a little bit more, Liberty, Seneca, and you can read kind of the others. I knew we had a lot of rain even when I was researching these numbers. I went, wow, that is really unique. Having grown up here, when most folks I know that are older than I am who are from here are like, yeah, we've never experienced like anything like this before. When we get a lot of rain, it's what, half that, 5 inches, 6 inches, something like that. And that's when the Reedy's up high and so forth. We experienced a lot of rain. I'm tired of the word unprecedented, so I'm not going to use that word. But and then you throw on top of that winds of 68 miles an hour, and it talks about the highest wind speeds recorded was up there on Sassafras Mountain. So you're talking about extremely high winds with probably pockets of stronger winds, but generally that's what we were dealing with. So I'm going to dive into a minute, like when we're talking trees, like how much wind is too much wind, right? And when really do we need to kind of be worried about this? But this is what happened last fall when we dealt with Hurricane Helene. So let's talk about the trees that we lost. We lost a lot of trees, a lot of species, but the ones that stood out, and I just listened to Drew Smith, who's the arborist with the city of Greenville, and he said the exact same 3 trees in his talk that I put on this before he did his talk. So white oak. I have some really big old white oaks on my property, and I have, as an arborist, I have told people for years, if I had a large tree near my house, top of the list would be a white oak. It pains me that white oaks went down. It absolutely pains me. Hickory trees went down, had a lot of hickory loss. Pecan or pecan, depending on where you're from. We can argue that one later. My wife and I think she's a pecan and I prefer pecan. So what are some of the things that these might have in common in the fall? Still have their leaves. Yep. There you go. Lots of nuts. Yep. So I know we have some years are more than others. And even if it wasn't a heavy year, it was still right at the time of year when they're heavily loaded, they're green, and they're carrying the most weight. So you saw branches that were probably bending a little bit more during that time. You have a fully leafed out, heavy, thick canopy and a nut load, right?
Also straw, rigid woods.
That's a good point.
Bend with the wind and then pop back up.
Not as flexible. That's a really good point. Huh. Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think pretty much all the big white oaks I lost on my property came up by the root system. One of them had some rot, but it still came up at the root system. The decay was down at the base. So the other thing is our trees here aren't as adapted to hurricane winds like they are down at the coast. Like a live oak only gets like, I mean, heck, you can take a really, a live oak that's hundreds of years old and it gets, 60 or 70 feet tall. Our trees here get 100 plus feet tall. And a lot of them are forest trees, so they're real tall and top heavy. So a lot of them, if you think about, a lot of the white oaks, a lot of trunk, a lot of high canopy. That's a lot of fulcrum up there, whipping back and forth, not swaying as much, probably more rigid. That's a good point. I hadn't actually put that together. And
over to them.
say that again.
You could pretty much determine the time of the last major hurricane by the age of the live oaks, because the big storms pick that up.
Right. Yeah. Eventually get to the point where, man, anything can break, but some things are more adapted to it than others. But yeah, certainly compared to a river birch or, trees that are more flexible. I saw a bunch of white oaks that fell over and the stupid sweet gum was still standing there. And I'm like, figures. Now sweet gum will lose a branch in a minute. When they get green gumballs, their branches are a little more brittle, but they have a pretty tenacious root system. So these were the trees that we saw the majority of that went down in our area. So cypress tree, like Leland cypress. Yeah. Yeah, I didn't include Leland cypress on this. That's true. I was thinking native trees, but yes, but Leland cypress, well, not a big fan of Leland cypress. I'm sure many of y'all are not. We're a fan of Leland cypress like we are at Bradford. Well, may not as well, Bradford pears. I think they were introduced about the same time. I feel like all the Leland cypress and Bradford pears were like, yeah, okay, there you go. And when was your neighborhood put in? Okay, yep, gotcha. Very popular plant around that time and before. So a lot of the Leland cypress are planted in rows. Wind hits that and it just has nowhere to go. So it's going to push through that. They also have more of a fibrous root system. And they just get really tall for the root system they have. But yes, a lot of Leland cypress down. So I tell people, I remember the ice storm of 05 here. If you weren't here, glad you missed it. If you were here, we thought that was horrible. And it was. But it was a unique event, very similar to Helene, although Helene was much worse because it hit a much larger area. So at this point, we had ice in our region that didn't hit the whole state. So in the upstate, we ranged anywhere from 1/4 of an inch of ice upwards to 3/4 to almost an inch of ice. So let's talk about that for a minute, because I want to talk about these unique events. Because when homeowners have me out, they go, well, Scott, are you sure that's okay? What if we have a ice storm, a tornado, a hurricane, and those are real things. And that's kind of what's starting to change the tone and conversations I'm having with people about their trees are events like this. So ever since this storm happened, we would get to like October, and it had been like 3 or 4 or 5 years, and people go, we haven't had an ice storm in a while, and we'd start talking about ice storms in, September, October. Do I need to do something for my trees? Do I need to take it down? Do I need to trim some things? So all these are things, well, I don't want to jump ahead, but so So let's think back to a couple, so these are a couple of big events that happened in this area in the last 20 years or so. So at what point is tree failure likely to occur? So when, like, they threatened some ice here, I think that was in January, when they were kind of calling the weather, they missed it, thank God. Just like they missed this last weekend. I'm glad we did not get the crazy windy weather that we thought we might get here. But when they start talking accumulations over 1/4 of an inch, that's when I get nervous, because that's when branches break and trees fail. The load and the weight on those branches, that's becomes the breaking point. Anything less than that, I can deal with. And we'll have a little bit, some Leland cypress will fall over, whatever, Bradford pears will split, and we'll go, thank goodness. So Mother Nature's weeding out some of the weaker junk. But our native species, we really run into problems when we get into ice over 1/4 of an inch. And we get wind speeds over 55 miles an hour. So again, if they're calling for like 30, 40 mile an hour winds, I'm fine. I know we're going to have a few things, but I know it's not going to be strong. Most of the time in our areas, when we have this, not the ice, but the 55 mile an hour winds, it's usually isolated incidences. It's microbursts. It's we've had some more tornadoes in this region than we've had in the past, but they're very, small events. Again, that hurricane just created a large wind force that hit such a large area. And that's really what, caused all the damage that. So my question down here is, how often does this happen? I mean, if any of y'all have been in this region, for any period of time, how often do we get large amounts of, ice accumulation and wind speeds in a large volume in this area? Yeah.
Versus isolated, the tornadoes are very isolated when they come through.
Yeah, I'd say in a large area. Yeah.
Once a decade.
Yep. Yeah. And now in small pockets, we have seen that, and I've seen that all my years of having been in this industry of small areas. But literally, you'll have a street or two and you'll go over to the next street and it's fine. It's like nothing happened. Microbursts often end up in that direction. So I remind people of this. I will say, by the way, just an interesting fact. And someone was talking about Paris Mountain earlier. I remember many years ago, we had, it was rainy in Greenville. It was on Friday. We were out to eat, and I get a call from one of my clients up on Paris Mountain, and she says, "How are y'all doing in this ice storm?" And I'm like, "What are you talking about?" I'm like, "There's no ice. There is a line when you go up Paris Mountain where you will start getting ice." And they had a 1/2 inch of ice. You know how much damage they had? Very little. Why? Because that climate has adapted to, and those trees have dealt with ice storms and more ice than we have down here in the lower part of the mountain. So even that much difference can make a difference of how trees can tolerate, having been subjected to that repeatedly, can tolerate ice levels there much differently than our trees just at the bottom of the mountain can. Yes. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay. Uh-huh. Okay. So what problems are you having with your palmetto? So we're talking about palm trees. Okay. Mm-hmm. Yep. So that's what they do. So we in the tree world, we joke that palm trees aren't a tree, that they're actually just a giant grass, because vascular, that's the way they're kind of oriented. So yeah, they're kind of stringy and they don't go through a chipper very well, although they will. We deal with them some. There is a place here not far from the airport that plants palm trees, and we have some cold hardy palms, Sable, Windmill, and a few others that will grow up here. They are out of their native range a bit. They do get a few more issues up here that they may not get down there. But that natural, as the new fronds come up, the old ones gradually kind of in a process kind of fall off, and those old ones, they'll hang on there for a long time. You can prune them off, like down the coast, they do it annually. Their landscapers go out there and they trim those up to keep them looking nice, but that's just kind of the natural process of a palm tree.
You're talking about the hurricane cuts that come? with
Yeah,
the
the hurricane cuts, yeah. Yeah, I've learned, I think I had a arborist that worked for us and she was from Florida. She's like 10 and 2. You generally don't want to go more than that. Even that's too much. So yeah, you really want to keep, because that's all the foliage it's got. I mean, you're talking about a plant that, I mean, just like anything needs foliage. So if you take too much of that canopy off, so once they start drumming and hanging down, that's probably the point where you can trim those off. It's more of an aesthetic thing. Eventually they'll fall
I
off.
curated one of the world's largest palm collections.
Okay.
I do not believe in cutting off any live leaves on a palm.
Yep. Just get them when they're brown.
If you try to branch off a tree, the tree will respond by compartmentalizing, and then we can go around it. You cut a leaf off, there's no compartmentalization. It's open to the package.
And that's one of the, one of the things with you're cutting off leaves where a tree, it's a whole different biology there. So, well, let's get into some tree. Let's get into some of exactly what you're talking about, because I want to talk about tree structure. So oftentimes as an arborist, we'll come out and we'll say, oh, your tree's not healthy. And they go, well, I don't want it falling on my house. So when we start talking about tree health, we talk about one thing. So when we talk about tree structure, we talk about another. So as we start talking about trees and storms, and what if we have what if we had gotten a little bit, or we did get some stormy weather? I mean, Sunday morning, it may not have been as bad as we thought, but we got a little bit of wind, we got some rain. Are my trees okay? So I show this cross section of a tree because and many of y'all might know this as plant people, y'all probably know the terms, cambium layer, xylem, phloem, that's all the vascular system of a tree. So for a tree to stay healthy and to move water and nutrients and sugars where it needs to, all that activity happens right beneath the bark. So when you think tree health, we're talking just beneath the bark of the tree. When we're talking about tree structure, that tissue does play some importance of that. But for the most part, that has to do with the center of the tree or the heartwood. So actually the middle of the tree, and again, y'all might know this, is actually dead. So it is not moving water nutrients up and down. That's why if you're ever hiking in the woods and you see a tree that's hollow and like you stick your head up in it, or raccoons are living up in it, and you look up and it's like, that tree is full of leaves. Like, how is that even possible? Well, it's because that vascular system is intact and is able to, to do all the, pass water nutrients up and down the trunk. But structurally, that's the tree sometimes those are the trees that will fall over when we have a storm event. So again, if we have a tree that is being attacked by insect and disease issues, oftentimes they are attacking that vascular system of the tree. They're going after the living part of the tree. If we're talking about the structure of the tree, we're talking about that center part. So when people say, well, my tree, it has some disease issues and we're talking about treating that, they're like, well, is it going to fall over? And I go, well, if the center of the tree is still intact and the structure of the tree is good, that's not necessarily a concern. So we have ways to measure for this. And we have things that we look for. So I have a checklist I like to give to people when they're in their yard. But if we suspect that a tree might have some rot or decay into it, we have a way to drill into it safely for the tree. So this device is called a resistograph, and it graphs, it's a tiny, tiny little drill bit, and it graphs the density of the wood inside the tree. So if we're worried that there could be rot or decay inside the tree, or someone wants to go like how do you know it's okay? This is a test that we can do. I'm going to give you a few things that you can do yourself and that you can keep an eye on if you are now worried since the storm, are my trees going to fall down? Again, no guarantees. The only way to eliminate the risk is really to eliminate the tree. However, in our world as arborists, 70 to 75% of tree failures occur from pre-existing conditions. And a lot of those can be identified. And that's often identified by mushroom growth at the base of the tree can indicate some rot going on the inside. Old pruning wounds or scars on the tree can lead, we were talking about compartmentalization. Trees do that well. If it's a really large wound, it may never seal over completely, and that tree may just rot in the middle. It may rot up from the ground, and it might be harder to tell. Sometimes mushroom growth, and there's certain types of mushroom, Inonotus, Ganoderma, are mushroom shelf fungi like this that grow at or near the base of the tree that indicate that there's some rot going on in that root system. Cracks, cavities, certainly since the storm, I've been out to trees that stood through the storm, and then because of the twisting and stress on the tree, we now see stress fractures that indicate, that a failure has occurred, or we see the soil heaving in that bottom corner where like the ground moved. Like that tree should not, trees can sway. And I get people, during the storm, it just moved all over the place. It's not a bad thing. You just heard rigid trees, trees that are less flexible didn't fare as well in the storm. So the more a tree sways, it actually is displacing that wind. It will actually move in almost like a figure 8 kind of pattern. So as wind hits it, it'll move and then duck out of the way and swerve back around and come back into place. And it will work into that wind. There's a guy by the name of Ed Gilman, who's out of University of Florida, who has just a giant turbine wind machine, and he just blasts air and wind at trees just to see how they react and how trees react to those types of forces. But generally speaking, trees should not move into the soil. If there's fracturing in the soil, then we need to, we might be concerned about, root damage that we can't see underground. The other thing that we witnessed was a lot of trees that have codominant stems. I use Bradford pears as an example, just because, they grow up and then they branch into lots of stems. So trees that have multiple stems, you have the situation here where these cross sections, and I know I'm pointing and we have folks online, but where you have the stump kind of look, you will see kind of separate circles. So you have several trunks trying to grow in one space, and each one of those circles wants to be its own tree. So it's growing rings outward. And then there's a lot of pushing happening in between those stems, which can create weakened areas in these V-shaped crotches that are prone to splitting. So oftentimes we identify those and we'll go in and just put a support wire or cable between those. Because what happens is, and then during a wind event, like a tree that has a single stem will move as one unit. When you have a tree with multiple stems, they will start swaying independently of each other. And that's a lot of pulling and pushing in a forked area that's already potentially weak, if that makes sense. So what the cable does, because I tell people the cable is not designed to keep, to catch the tree if it falls, is to make the tree sway as one unit and not having that thing swaying in multiple directions and a lot of pulling happening in those tight forked regions. So again, if there are things like this, like decay, that we can identify, some things we can help out with, like cabling trees. Some trees, if it's rotten or hollow in there, the answer might be it has to come out. Or if there's something going on and we can eliminate, if there's a limb that has some decay in it, maybe we can eliminate the limb. Maybe we can just take some weight off of it. You were talking about, I'm getting to your question. Tell me your name. Bonnie. Okay, so Bonnie brought up mulch and roots and, was it maple trees? Yeah, girdling roots. So this is the one picture. I'm glad I left it in here. So how do we know if that tree's good in the soil? Because above ground, we can look for cracks, cavities, mushroom growth, but what's happening there at the base of the tree? So if you look at the tree in the top left, you have a tree that looks kind of like a telephone pole stuck in the ground. A lot of trees that are planted look like that because maybe they were planted too deep, or maybe mulch was piled up on it. And a tree that has grown out in the woods, I always tell people, if you give a kid a crayon and they draw a tree, usually they kind of draw the bottom of the tree kind of flaring out. So we call this a trunk flare or root flare. And this, with that being present, I can kind of get, if everything above ground in that lower picture looks healthy to me, there's not loose bark, there's no mushrooms on that, I can pretty much assume that probably the root system of that tree is in pretty good shape. There's probably no broader decay coming up and traveling up to that root system. When you have the situation above here, you have a portion of the tree underground that's not supposed to be, and I'll show you another picture. So, sometimes you can have, planting straps that were left on the tree. Even if it's not planting straps, roots love to grow in mulch. So if you pile mulch up against the base of the tree, roots will go, oh, great. And they'll start growing. And because it's right at the base of the tree, they will start circling or creating girdling roots. And I removed my girdling root pictures, but in that top right was a situation where a tree was planted too deep. We came in with kind of an air spade. It's like digging with like a pressure washer, just without the water, using air, and exposed that area. So you had dirt up against the trunk that was causing the bark to be loose and starting to rot a little bit. And then you had roots that were circling, and those were eliminated. But I have had trees that look fine growing, and then all of a sudden we had a bad storm. It literally snapped off at the ground. It's like, what happened? There was either an old planting strap that was there, or there was a girdling root that was constricting around the base of that. So a lot of these structural issues, a lot of these things when trees are younger can cause problems much later on in the life of the tree. So correcting those girdling roots. It's hard when they get older. Yeah. Uh-huh. Mm-hmm. It sank into the ground? Yeah, probably at this point, yeah, you're not replanting it. And ideally you don't want a bowl at the base of the tree, but oftentimes you have to correct with what you have. So no telling why that tree settled. I know sometimes they'll plant palms with like some sand around it. And depending on what. Yep. Oh, yes. Okay. Absolutely. So the comments are about the palm tree that you had planted and that it settled into the ground. And it looks like the tree in the top corner. So that is unusual. Most trees don't settle usually after they're planted, and palm trees don't really have their roots are pretty much right at the base of the tree. They don't really spread out. So
People usually often do, not usually, but often say, well, they'll plant it deep to avoid putting braces on it.
Right.
It was braces.
Planet up above ground. Up from the city before. Got down deeper, all of a sudden. Thick.
all right. Yeah. But yeah, palms are heavy. And again, you don't have a lot of footprint with a palm tree. Again, all those, I mean, when it was planted, it just comes in a small little ball for such a tall tree. So yes, please do. Yes. So that oftentimes, most of the time it's evergreens. Usually if we have an evergreen that leans over because of some wind or some snow or some ice, we tie it up and we forget all about it. Or we plant a tree and we tie it up and we forget all about it. I see this oftentimes on residential properties, usually in evergreens, because again, it started to lean over, so we tied it up and forgot about it. On commercial properties, landscaper comes in, plants trees, and then nobody, they're just there. Whoever's blowing off the parking lot or cutting the grass isn't necessarily paying attention to that. And again, I've seen those snap off right. And this is the center picture I'm pointing at where that tie was put in. So that's exactly what that is. So let's get into a couple more slides, and I want to leave a few minutes for questions. I want to make sure I'm on time as well. So some things that worked. So again, we had a lot of trees that failed, even trees that we had taken care of and so forth and had on programs. However, we did see some benefits to trees that had been pruned every 3 to 5 years. So going in, removing dead branches, thinning the canopy out, taking some weight off on leaving side, doing some strategic pruning on a mature tree every 3 to 5 years makes a difference. And so it's very subtle. It's not like, I always tell people, it's like a good haircut. You kind of look at somebody and go, did you get your haircut? Yeah, it looks a little different. So a good pruning job kind of has that look to it. So if you look at the picture and look at the sunlight that's hitting the grass, that also kind of shows how much light is now getting through that canopy from when it was, from before it was pruned and then when it was pruned. And then of course, there's kind of a caricature of what a good selective crown thinning looks like, so that when we get strong winds, it can pass through that canopy a lot easier. And it's not a lot of, we call it the sail of the tree. There's less sail up there and the wind can pass through it a little bit easier. Structural pruning, thinning, makes a big difference. And we saw that in a lot of the trees that we've been taking care of. Personally, I treated all the big oak trees, all the big trees within striking distance of my house 2 or 3 years ago with a growth regulator. It's a plant hormone. It's applied at the base of the tree and it redirects energy of the canopy of the tree towards the root system. So it primarily doesn't help grow like big woody roots, but it helps to redirect energy mainly towards like the more fibrous root growth and things like that. But we saw trees that we had applied that to, so redirect energy from the canopy, so you're not getting as much canopy growth every year, to the root system made a big difference. And so this lasts for 3 years. So plants have hormones just like we do. And like this time of year, there's hormones saying, okay, we need to, put energy towards canopy growth. And then in the fall, the opposite happens. And if tree is impacted, like if tree has root damage, it will send energy in different directions to help regenerate root growth or regenerate canopy growth. Like this year, trees that have had canopy damage, the trees are going to say like, I need leaves. So I'm going to start putting energy towards leaf growth. Yes. Yep. So, yep. And so, it's applied. It has a 3-year recovery residual, and most big trees, I don't need it to grow anymore. So it works well as a growth regulator if you want to control the size of a tree, but it also has some other health benefits. The leaves will be darker green, be more resistant to insect and disease issues. That energy is going to go somewhere. It's just going to get redirected. Again, doing things for our urban trees. And I stress that I don't necessarily fertilize trees that are out in the woods, but we put mycorrhizae, which is beneficial fungi, bacteria, worm castings, amino acids, sea kelp extract. We try and get a lot of that back into the soil to get trees, to put back what would normally would occur naturally out in the woods. So this is something that we've done. So obviously, a healthier tree is going to be, and a healthier root system is going to be able to withstand mainly insect and disease issues, but it will also, help in, storm situations or recovery from storm situations. Most of and this is what we're worried about. I want to touch on this because this is what we're worried about this spring and this year is there was a lot of tree damage. We have a lot of trees on the ground. Ambrosia beetle, which is a boring type insect, can take out a mature oak tree in weeks or months. If people say, I went on vacation, the tree is alive, I came back, it was dead, I go look for sawdust around the base of the tree. These are opportunistic, oh, good news. These are opportunistic problems, meaning that these are going after trees that are in poor health. And right now we're worried about trees that did make it through the storm, but that were impacted either by, root damage that we can't see, canopy damage, structural damage. If there was some, twisting, we have some damage to the vascular system of the tree. We're worried about these beetles and these diseases going after our remaining trees. I'm going to skip this just for a minute because again, I want to stay on time. So I have another, there's my other picture. Okay. So real quickly, so since Helene, and even since the ice storm a little bit, if I reflect back long enough, we, as a tree company, we get a lot of trees. Hey, I love my tree. I want to make sure it stays healthy and, I love the shade and all that sort of stuff. And it has gone from, I remember, I do talks and people always had just great tree stories, climbing trees as kids and, and forts and playing in the woods and all that sort of stuff. And now is my tree okay? Do I have to worry about my tree? So all of a sudden, these big things that were around us that gave us all the shade and all the great stories are now riddled with, I had one fall in my house. I saw one, my neighbor, I saw it on the news. This is now happening. I don't want this to happen, and I don't want this to happen either. And if you had this happen to you or someone you knew, that's a big deal. And yeah, if you have other big trees around your house, you're probably going to go, I don't know if I want those anymore. And that's really hard. As arborists, we try and talk about tree health, tree structure, and educate folks so they know that yes, there are risks with having that tree, but but what are really the chances of this happening again? Could it happen again? Absolutely. But there are some things you can do to reduce risk. We talked about pruning, we talked about growth regulators and things like that. But we're being asked to do more risk assessments, like just, is my tree safe? And even if we say they are, people are still a little uncertain. And so we're trying to get back to doing more tree care and preventive kind of maintenance stuff. But right now we have a high fear factor, and we have a lot of tree companies that just bought a lot of equipment for tree removal, and they got to keep that equipment busy. We bought a crane during the storm. Trying to get cranes was insane. We've been talking about for years. It's a great tool, but there are a lot of people taking down trees. There are a lot of tree companies saying, yeah, since the storm, you might want to think about taking that tree out. In some instances, it might be the right decision if there is a structural issue or concern. Or depending on the species, some species are more problematic than others. I tell people, not all pine trees are bad and not all oak trees are good. Clemson University started taking down their post oaks because there was a black rot that they had several fall over on campus, and there was a black rot that was coming up through the root system that was virtually undetectable. And after a few failures, they just didn't trust that particular species anymore on their campus. So they went after some of the older, more mature post oaks. So that's really what has happened. And what we're doing about it, much like y'all are doing education, is educating people about, okay, what happened and what, because a lot of the clients that we deal with, they really want to keep their trees, but they also are now scared of their trees, and maybe for good reason. But it's like, now how do we deal with that? And how do we keep the trees that we do desperately need in Greenville? And not get that knee-jerk reaction. Because I had a lot of people during the storm that said, yep, and after I get that tree that fell, I want to get that one and that one and that one. And I went, okay, well, let's deal with that, and then we'll come back out and we'll kind of walk the yard and we'll talk about your other trees. So it's an interesting situation. We will have more storms. We'll probably have small little things here and there. Hopefully nothing big again, at least not in my career. I'm after the ice storm, I didn't ever want to deal anything like that again. And then, Helene hit about 20 years later. And, we're dealing with a bigger mess. So kind of unique to our area and stuff that we've been dealing with. So that's what we've seen in terms of, what we saw fail and what we're seeing now as a result of the storm. And it will ebb out a little bit as time passes. But there will always be, when we get into hurricane season, probably like ice season, well, what if? And I go, well, if you want to throw out tornadoes and hurricanes and ice storms, like, all bets are off. But under normal circumstances, a normal weather event, I go back to that 70-75% of tree failures. And if we can help identify those, or if you see something, I always tell people, I'd much rather come out and look at something and go, oh, it's fine, than, oh, I wish you had called me sooner. So always, that's where we're at. Any questions? Yes, we got a couple right here. I will repeat the question and do my best to answer it. We'll just go in order. Go ahead.
I'm in Newberry.
Okay.
So one of the things we saw was oaks by far were the trees that fell over.
Mhm.
Pine trees, if anything happened to them, they snapped off 10, 20 feet up.
Okay.
What I'm worrying about here, I look at and really love this local park called Lynch's Woods, where 100 or more trees fell over in a 200-acre area.
Wow.
But some of the trees, a lot of the trees didn't fall over. And so I'm wondering, it was late summer, coming into fall, trees sort of lost their leaves, and then you're wondering, maybe that damage was a little bit more so, and so sort of curious in the spring, what new growth is gonna come out? Are you thinking along those lines of trees that survived? I mean, trees that were down, they
Right.
kept their green leaves for well over a month.
Right.
So I'm wondering if some of these trees are damaged, they just didn't fall over, but yeah, they're gonna die.
Yeah, so trees are pretty tough. So when we had the ice storm, a lot of the canopies broke out of the top, especially the top branches. So you're talking about trees that are still standing that had a lot of damage in the top. How are they going to respond?
Well, sometimes it visibly look bad,
Mm-hmm.
and you don't cut the leaves, they don't. Just sort of wondering about, are there trees, I mean, in particular, at this park, an arborist went out there and spray painted red when the trees were dead. I looked up there, yep, it snapped off, it's a goner. But then they also sprayed some of them with yellow paint and thinking, how do I know if that's still alive or not?
Gotcha.
And I'm thinking maybe they were doing the same thing, thinking this one looks like it had a little damage. Let's come back and check it again next spring into summer when the leaves have come out.
Right. Yeah. So not knowing how they color code or for whatever reason, but I would imagine most trees that made it through the storm are going to leaf out. And even some that had heavy canopy damage will probably sucker out like crazy. I hate to use the crepe myrtle example, but when crepe myrtles chop them off, they sprout back all over the place. Now, an older tree is going to have a harder time recovering from that. A younger tree that had damage will probably recover better. But we saw a lot of trees during that after the ice storm in 05 that put out a lot of new growth on, damaged canopies and did okay. But again, a lot of wounds, we talk about wounds in trees, you have entry points for insect and disease issues. It's a stressor. I mean, the tree had a certain amount of canopy. Some of that may have been lost. Now the tree's having to regrow that. That takes energy and resources to do that. And so that the tree is going to be a little more compromised and weaker in that state, to recover from that. So if you're looking at a tree and there's not much visible damage, it probably will be okay. There could be some hidden stuff, but we are worried about those opportunistic, insect and disease, issues that may get some of that underlying stuff that we're not seeing. Yes. Okay. Well, roots can get through the clay. I mean, again, in an urban setting, I'm trying to think of the best way to kind of answer your question. So the clay soils are certainly an inhibitor for root growth, but a lot of it is just in that urban setting, and there's just not a good environment for that. So that growth regulator redirects energy towards, putting out more fibrous root growth. Where in a forest situation, that's a lot easier for the tree to do. And the soils are a little bit more favorable, but roots will grow. If you've ever, again, been hiking and you see a tree like growing out of a root, like a rock, and it's like, where are those roots? They will find cracks and crevices, in sidewalk cracks and things like that. And so you're encouraging more of that fibrous root growth into those areas. Yes, that's correct. Yep. Yes, go ahead. Okay.
Now I'm wondering, is there much chance that it can survive if I start putting growth regulators on it?
Ooh, I wish I had a picture I could show you. Yeah, well, I mean, of a tree that I dealt with. So the question was, had a tree, your neighbor, obviously the root system extended onto their property. They did some grading work, got into some of the roots of your tree. I had someone over in Chanticleer, over near the hospital, and they literally put a wall like right at the root flare of the tree. I mean, the builder came in, he's like, we got to put in a wall. God bless him. He at least used a Sawzall and made some nice clean cuts, but he was literally on a 24-inch diameter tree. He was within a foot off of the root flare and went down like 4 feet. Put growth regulator on that thing 3 years. It's still there. long-term, that tree's, the fact I've gotten it to live three years after that, like after literally like 45-50% root loss, speaks volumes to what that growth regulator was able to do. But that's when I keep taking pictures every year. So it's not too late, because again, if you've had root loss, you're redirecting energy towards the root system. But I've used it in a few situations like that where we've had some root damage. That one was more of an experiment that I'm still, even with the growth regulator, I'm surprised that that tree is actually still alive. So not too late. Trees are amazing and a very adaptable organisms. It's amazing what they can tolerate. It's amazing they grow in downtown Greenville in little holes in the sidewalk, but they find cracks and crevices and they do pretty well. So yeah, something to consider. Normally root damage, if a tree is impacted like that, can take 3 to 5 years to show up. So if it's just happened or happened the last few years, you're not quite out of the woods yet with it. Yes. Oh, good.
It's growing beneath my foot. Is it best to try to dig out the grass and then damaging the roots of the tree, or to kill the ground with Roundup before long?
Ooh, wow, good question. So herbicides, we have seen a lot of herbicide damage over the years with trees. So most herbicides, some are safer than others, but there are certain ones that are problematic for trees. And the way herbicides, a lot of herbicides work, they have to absorb through a soft tissue. So honestly, if you hit the trunk of the tree, probably fine. The bark's a pretty strong deterrent. If it hits those little fine fibrous root systems that's near the surface, that's where trees can absorb it and you can get dieback. So I've learned this from a lot of you folks and master gardeners. You can do layers of newspaper, cardboard, and put mulch on top. I'm not a big fan of the weed barrier, the plastic and the stuff you put down there, because that inhibits the mulch decomposing from getting into the soil. I have said put down a good layer of mulch, and then as the grass comes up through it, you can kind of spot spray it a little bit. If you have a good thick layer of mulch, that will protect the root system. You really get into trouble with herbicides when you really like soak it down. So putting down some sort of barrier that will decompose, you can dig it out. I would say dig it out some, maybe put down some newspaper cardboard trick. I think I've heard that called the lasagna, something like that. Okay, Rick's nodding, so we're gonna say that's a good one. Throw down a good layer of mulch, and then Bermuda is tough. So as it comes up, a small squirt ball, and you can squirt those little areas a little bit's a good one. What else you got? Oh, I love those questions. So my favorite tree is the American beech. Big fan of American beech. I know that doesn't work in all situations. I still go back to, someone said, I don't know, someone mentioned, don't want to plant oak since that storm. I'm still a big fan of oaks. We have a lot of good oak trees around here. I still would say white oak is still a really good tree. I'm not, even though we had issues with it in the storm, I still would not. But in terms of like a large shade tree, beeches are really, really good, pre-adaptable. They tend to grow in low moist areas. And then there's lots of good varieties of oaks, white oak, not all oak, Shumard oak, things like that.
A tree we're offering in a plant sale, the chalk bark maple, which doesn't get terribly large, seems to be like a really good tree.
The chopped bark?
Chalk.
Oh, chalk. Yeah, okay. Yeah. Okay.
Spreading rather
Gotcha.
good fall color.
I have heard of that, but I'd have to Google that one to remember what it's.
It's an abundant tree in the Piedmont.
Right.
Newberry County just dominating some of.
So that was chalk bark maple for just kind of repeat that was offered as an option.
And the name chalk comes from kind of sort of a whiter color bark.
Yeah.
And you're exactly right about the color in the fall. You can get the orange, the red, and yellows.
I usually cultivate situation usually see a single standard type.
So you get, I mean, again, it depends on what you're looking for, smaller tree, larger tree, mid-sized tree. I know a lot of our native dogwoods are struggling a bit. There's a lot of red buds out there, and they've done a lot more of breeding varieties of those that, pardon me, that are doing a little bit better than the dogwoods are. So for a small flowering, blooming tree, you know, things like that, so. All right, one more and then I'll step out of here, and I'll stick around for those people in person, happy to answer more questions. Mm-hmm. Yep. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Their canopy was not very good to begin with, if they were crowded with.
Okay, yep.
What am I going to see? Are those going to put on a better canopy now that they have? What should I be looking for to see if they're healthy?
Right. So, so the question was, live in a forest environment, lost a lot of trees. The few trees that are standing are kind of your bare kind of forest trees that are left. Yeah, a few limbs on it. So because they will start getting more light, they will start putting out more growth. They're not going to regrow like larger limbs again. And because I get people like, will it ever, you know, fill out? And I go, not really, because it's spent the first 40 or 60 years of its life kind of doing that. So you're just looking for how it will normally leaf out. The Mhm. Yeah, yep. So how do you know if your trees are healthy? You're looking for a good leaf color, nice dark green color. You're looking for dieback at the top. So if a tree isn't getting the water and nutrients it needs, or it can't take it up, it'll start dying back at the tips. So you're looking at the very tips, the parts furthest from the root system. Are those leaves dark green, full size, and fully leafed out, or are they bare? And that's how you assess the health of a tree. Good question. I'm going to end on that one, and again, I'll be around. Thank y'all so much.
Okay, that was good enough. Thank you, Scott. That was a great talk and timely. And I'm gonna be pushing for trees tomorrow at another meeting. So talking about the value of trees in our rivers, watersheds. So again, great turnout tonight. And great thank you for all folks for being online tonight and listening in. Thank you all folks for being here tonight. And we'll call it an evening. If you can, take your chairs and just put them right back over here, and that'll help us clean up. Thank you.
I'm Ash.
So much.